when we were starting to look for stuff on Gates, like, because when I was growing up, in the 90s, I remember he was more of like kind of a public figure, or at least I saw him. I remember in like sort of commercials and those like big like tech events and stuff, but I never like paid too much attention to him outside of that, like that constructed image of like, I'm the nerd king, right? Like I'm like this mild-mannered guy. And so I was just like, looking around on like YouTube for like, Bill Gates biography and like getting into it. And it's so glowing.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's so positive. And there's so much particular stuff for like kids. Mm-hmm. Like there's like children's books about Bill Gates. There's like cartoons and like YouTube biographies that are specifically like for kids to watch about Bill Gates, and it's just so like bleak. I don't know. It's so horrible to sift through that stuff.
I mean, you have to learn about a glorious leader, Bill Gates, who made the internet, right?
That's right.
A lot of people think it was Al Gore, but it was actually Bill Gates.
I really liked the Triumph of the Nerds thing that we watched that had like all the background.
That was so awful. That was so bad.
I remember as I was a kid and I saw, do you remember the South Park movie that came out in like 1999 or whatever? Do you remember there's the scene in that movie where like Bill Gates is in it for a second and then like the military guy like shoots him in the head? I saw that in theaters as a kid, and like I remember when that scene happened, everybody like people in the theater cheered, which at the time I didn't understand, but now when I look back, pretty cool.
Good for them.
Yeah.
they were right to celebrate.
That's right.
Ahead of their time. I mean, because he was reviled at the time, right? He was reviled in the 90s, especially because of the antitrust case, where he just came off as such a fucking asshole. And then, like, he learned that if you have enough money, you can actually pay people to create a false image of you. And now then he became the God Emperor of Nerds,
Yeah.
I was wondering about that because, like, I mean, we were talking before we started recording about, like, again, and sort of searching through this stuff, and even just like the initial idol searches when we're usually like pick out somebody on the show, especially somebody who's like really notorious or has a huge amount of money, as a contemporary person. It's usually like easy to find like some criticism of them like pretty quickly, but in just like looking for like a Bill Gates biography, like in Google search or on like YouTube, like I said, it took like many pages in to find anything even like remotely critical. And I was like, oh, is that what you can do if you have money?
He's one of the good ones. He's one of the good ones. He's giving all his money away, right? Even though he's still worth like 124 billion or whatever their net worth is currently.
Yeah, no, that's what you can do if you have money and you name search, right? Anything is possible.
Oh God, if he's like on Twitter, like name searching and responding and dropping links, I'm incredibly philanthropic. I was not on the plane.
Or no, yeah, quotes Gates, quote Epstein.
Now when I was a young boy, about the age of 5, my teachers taught me I could be the greatest man alive. They told me I could change the world, be whatever I wanted to be. There was no one in the world like me. Every one of us was so unique. I'd not be an average man. No, sir, I'd be no average man. So I had those big dreams.
Welcome back, everybody, to Eat the Rich, the show about our political economy, late-stage capitalism, and the millionaires, billionaires, and multinational corporations hell-bent on staving off its death rattle. I'm Shane, and tonight we have with us Chris.
Howdy.
Carrie.
Hello.
And very happy to welcome back to the show staff writer at Vice and co-host of This Machine Kills pod, Ed Ongweso Jr. Ed, how you doing, man?
Doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on again.
Thank you for joining us to talk about, as we said, our favorite God King of technology. Kind of like the original, right? The awful patriarch of this like long lineage now of like weird tech goblins who like have ruined all of our lives. And he's been in the news recently. There's a couple of
all good things,
unfolding stories as we sort of hinted at. And so I thought, this would, he's been somebody that has been in our sights, or maybe I should say on our list. I guess both of those sound equally threatening. He's somebody that we've wanted to talk to for quite a while, and it seemed in light of some recent events, now was as good a time as any. And so to start off, we'll walk through like a bit of his bio and his background, and talk about where he came from and the foundation of Microsoft. And like I had mentioned, prior to the introduction, right? Like a lot of it is like very positive, and it's the same kind of stories you see over and over again that we've talked about endlessly on the show. Some iteration of like the rags to riches thing, or like the nerd in his garage kind of complement to that happens with all the Silicon Valley guys. And in looking at his bio, like it is pretty boring. Like he seems like himself as like a fairly like boring person, like not as perhaps quirky or outlandish as some of the other like people that we've covered on the show, but he is like a boomer, right? 1955 is when he was born, so that's still well in the baby boom. He was born in Seattle to father William Henry Gates and his mother Mary Gates. Sort of an upper middle class family. Again, a lot of his early life, it's all of this kind of like pandering stuff about like, oh, he was always such a precocious child. He was a genius from a young age. He was so curious. There's like this one anecdote that I saw repeated endlessly where it was like when he was like 6 or 7, he read the encyclopedia and his parents were like so wowed by that, right? Like he read it back to front, which again just seems like a sort of normal thing to do if you're like a child and you have an encyclopedia. It's like a weird thing to like brag about. I don't know. It's like obviously you're like, hey, I read Wikipedia when I was a kid. But in any case,
like, did he really read it? Like, I'm sure he sat down with it, but did he really?
Yeah, right.
Right, exactly. Like a lot of us as kids probably like open up the dictionary or something. But I don't know. It seems like one of those weird like kind of fake stories. Yeah,
it's such a boring fake story to make up too.
They focus tested it. They got a focus group. They're like, what gets like maximum approval ratings, but doesn't raise too many like eyebrows.
Again, since his actual like kind of childhood seems quite uninteresting and boring, I figured it would be more interesting to talk about his family background. So his father was a lawyer and came from a line of similarly kind of upper middle class businessmen who had moved out west for the gold rush in the 1800s. Now his mother, his side, her name was Mary, and she was also known as Giggles for some odd reason, but that's brought up a number of times as well. She came from a banking family called the Maxwells, who had similarly moved west from, they moved out west from Iowa, but for different reasons, not for the gold rush.
Is there any relation to another famous Maxwell group?
I wouldn't be sure about that, but
that would be really good.
Oh, that would be too good.
Yeah.
So I just to give you a sense of like the kind of lineage that he comes from, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Maxwells here, and I'm getting this and a lot of the information of his early life from this one biography called Gates by Stephen Maines and Paul Andrews that I believe came out in like the 90s. But here's from one of the early chapters, here's a little tidbit about, this would be James Willard Maxwell, who would be his matrilineal grandfather or great-grandfather. So reading from the book here, James Willard Maxwell had ventured west from Lincoln, Nebraska, with more than a decade of banking already under his belt. The son of a physician who had helped lay out the town of Lincoln, Maxwell had been born in 1864 in Iowa. Quote, "The Indians really were wild." Okay. He would relate in his 80s. "At every Indian scare, my family kept moving eastward from Lincoln, Nebraska, until the family was in Iowa. Then I was born, and we went back." So, and then eventually that, again, encouraged the long move westward, eventually to get to the West Coast. Now, skipping a little bit here from from the end of his life, perhaps J.W.'s greatest bequest was a Spartan work ethic and competitive spirit. Headlined Banker's Hours, They Mean Little to Maxwell, a 1929 Seattle Star story told how J.W. arrived at his office an hour earlier than the rest of the workforce, despite an oppressive 45-minute commute by public bus from his summer home. 55 years later, night owl Bill Gates would lose at least one girlfriend by insisting on a 7-hour turnaround between leaving work in the evening and arriving back the next morning.
Oh, come on.
An avid tennis player into his 70s, JW organized a bank industry tournament, quote, and offered the Loving Cup prize. Then I played for the title myself. I took a beating over that. You give the cup and then try to win it yourself. Fine thing, people scoffed. I'd have given anything to win, but I never did. Anything to win? That attitude would again and again be ascribed to JW's great-grandson. Maxwell kept working through his 85th birthday, telling associates he was too busy to think of retirement. A year later, he was reportedly accumulating magazine covers of pretty girls to paper his garage.
Go off.
When he died in 1951, he amassed a fortune appraised at $265,000 in a widely diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate. 5 years before, his late wife, Belle Oakley Maxwell, had left an estate valued at roughly $450,000. So the reason why I wanted to bring that up is, like, first of all, like, a weird line of this kind of Protestant work ethic freak, right? Who's just like, you have to work all day, get there an hour earlier, all that kind of stuff. Like, that all goes into Gates' upbringing, but also, like, maybe not like the uber wealthy, but like a pretty sizable fortune. Is what Gates is able to build on, and that's the support network that he comes from, right? So it is sort of maybe a minor point, but to me it does help demystify this idea of like, oh, it's because he pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, right? No, he like came from like a pretty wealthy family, and to that point as well, like, again, he was quirky. Even the fawning biographies can't get over the fact that like everybody thought he was annoying and weird as a child. And even his parents, who I guess were fairly conservative, like, didn't like that he was like inquisitive or curious or whatever. And he got in trouble at school a few times. And so they send him to a prep school in Seattle. And there's all these like notes about how like sad they were that they had to send him to the prep school because they both really believed in public education. But unfortunately, they had to send their son to this like fancy lad academy that was supposed to like discipline them. And the name of the school is called Lakeside. And so Bill Gates goes there at the age of 13. And this is where like the whole kind of mythic element of the story gets introduced on the technological angles, because a year into him being at this private school, the school buys a teletype terminal that's connected to like a GE computer. And so the students have like free access to use this computer time. And so Bill Gates, as like a young teen, gets like obsessed with it. And he spends pretty much all of his high school time, like, trying to work his way out of class so he can like spend time messing around on the computer. And the reason why this is a moment worth mentioning beyond like the stupid biographical, like, blowing smoke up his ass kind of thing, is because like, think about the access that's afforded there, right? Like, he's like a rich, like, white kid in like the most splendor of suburbia during like the peak of like the baby boomer like age, right? Like at the height of that. And in the late 1960s, he has access to like a multi-million-dollar computer system that like very few people have access to as a young teenager. Yeah. So that's a big element. And the other part here is that he meets Paul Allen, who is also at Lakeside, who's like a few years older than him, and they strike up a friendship and this obsession over the computer. Okay, so blah, blah, blah. There's like a whole bunch of shit here about all the little ins and outs, and like, oh, he made like computer games, and then, they would improve each other's computer games. And then there was all this stuff about them like, hacking the computer and finding new ways to like get extra computer time. Because at that point, like, the school was like paying a license for like how much time they actually had to like process the programs on the computer. And I don't want to get too bogged down in the details of this, but essentially him and his pals come up with a way to circumvent having to pay for the time on the computer. They basically like cheat the company that is like offering that service. And that's mentioned, again, as a sort of like playful entrepreneurial spirit thing, but it does come up later, I think, in an important way, and we'll come back to that. But anyway, Gates and Allen, they start like a company while they're in high school called Trafo Data, which is supposed to do something with traffic data, whatever. It sucks. It doesn't work, but it's like, again, it's part of this mythic, like, this was the early inklings of what would later become. And so then he gets into Harvard. He apparently like scored a perfect or almost perfect score on his like math on SATs, and he reportedly would like ask girls like what they got on their SATs because he wouldn't like he didn't want to date anybody that like didn't also get a perfect, because I'm sure women were just throwing themselves.
I was also
18-year-old
when you said that,
kid.
I was imagining also like he wants to tell them that he got a perfect score, but he doesn't want to come out and say it. So first he asks them what they got, like a way to, say it so that he can impress them.
What a great move!
Right? Yeah,
Smart. I mean, this is why he's a billionaire.
right. This is one of those in those books that are like, the lessons that you can learn to like become a billionaire like Bill Gates. The first one is
how to influence and creep out your friend. There you go.
Mansplain your SAT scores to every woman who will listen to you for more than a second. Yeah. Anyway, the big turn, at Harvard, of course, he has more access to computers, and eventually he keeps working on stuff with Paul Allen, and the big turn comes when this company called Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, it's just MITS, MITS, they come out with a new personal computer thing. It's like one of the first, consumer accessible kind of little microcomputers called the Altair 8800. And Gates and Allen see this as an opportunity to be like, hey, let's try to write software for it. There's sort of competing stories here, but one of them is like they didn't have the system at all, and they just kind of called up and claimed that they could do it. And so then MITS said, sure, come in and demo it for us, and maybe we'll hire you. And they sort of bluffed their way into this position. But they set up a meeting. They show their software they have for it. It's some kind of interpreter or early OS type program called Altair Basic, and the Altair likes them, or I'm sorry, MITS likes them. They hire them, and this is when they start Microsoft in 1975. So they move out to Albuquerque, and they start Microsoft. And from here, they start selling this software, the Altair Basic. And here's where it starts to get interesting. So this is their first taste of some actual success. They're successfully selling the software. And I want to read again from this bio, because there's an interesting point here that you might be familiar with, the open letter to hobbyists that Bill Gates writes. And this kind of sets it up nicely. So reading here, Bill wasn't exaggerating the number of copies that had been sold, provided you counted a few bootlegs. Roughly 900 copies had been accounted for between July and the year's end. So this is 1975, and they're talking about the Altair Basic software. And revenues were growing, albeit irregularly. In January, the royalty stream would amount to about $6,000, in February $12,000, in March $8,000, in April $12,000 again. Not bad at all for a college junior. Yet, as with Trafo data, the get-rich-quick dream far outstripped the reality. It was crazy. Here, MITS was shipping maybe 1,000 machines a month, yet Basic was selling in the low hundreds. Sure, not every Altair owner had the teletype or terminal Basic demanded, but even so, the discrepancy was ridiculous, like selling thousands of cassette players, but hardly any cassettes. In December, Bill had put his finger on the reason. Quote, if anyone is using Basic version 1.1, they have a copy of a tape that was stolen back in March. No customers were ever shipped 1.1, and it was experimental and full of bugs. And most galling, there were no other OEM customers, original equipment manufacturers, the common but misleading term for companies that would adopt a product like Altair Basic and sell it under their own label. Despite the best efforts clause in the contract, MITS hadn't managed to license Altair Basic to anyone else, and it didn't seem to be trying very hard. Cheap and free Basics were beginning to creep onto the market from other sources. Altair Basic ran rings around the other versions, but technical superiority wasn't enough. Price and availability were becoming a problem. Let me skip ahead here a little bit and pick back up. In February, Gates wrote a letter intended to gain him fame and notoriety within the microcomputer community, if not a few extra bucks besides. Called An Open Letter to Hobbyists, the impassioned tirade was featured prominently in Computer Notes. To add impact, MIT's media maven Bunnell sent it via special delivery mail to every major computer publication in the country. And quote, this is the letter that Bill Gates writes. To me, the most critical thing in the hobby market right now is the lack of good software courses, books, and software itself. Without good software and an owner who understands programming, a hobby computer is wasted. Will quality software be written for the hobby market? Almost a year ago, Paul Allen and myself, expecting the hobby market to expand, hired Monte Davidoff and developed Altair Basic. Though the initial work took only 2 months, the three of us have spent most of the last year documenting, improving, and adding features to Basic. Now we have 4K, 8K, Extended, ROM, and Disk Basic. The value of the computer time we have used exceeds $40,000. The feedback we have gotten from the hundreds of people who say they're using Basic has all been positive. Two surprising things are apparent, however. One, most of these users, and he puts users in quotes, never bought Basic. Less than 10% of all Altair owners have bought Basic. And two, the amount of royalties we have received from sales to hobbyists makes the time spent on Altair Basic worth less than $2 an hour. Why is this? As the majority of hobbyists must be aware, most of you steal your software. Hardware must be paid for, but software is something to share. Who cares if the people who worked on it get paid? Is this fair? One thing you don't do by stealing software is get back at MITS for some problem you may have had. MITS doesn't make money selling software. The royalty paid to us, the manual, the tape, and the overhead make it a break-even operation. One thing you do is prevent good software from being written. Who can afford to do professional work for nothing? What hobbyist can put 3 man's years into programming, finding all bugs, documenting his product, and distribute for free? The fact is, no one besides us has invested a lot of money in hobby software. Blah, blah, blah. Some more hobbies written. Some more software is written.
He's so mad.
What about the guys who resell Altair Basic? Aren't they making some money on hobby software? Yes, but those who have been reported to us may lose in the end. They are the ones who give hobbyists a bad name and should be kicked out of any club meeting they show up at. I would appreciate any letters from anyone who wants to pay up or has a suggestion or comment. Just write me at, and then he wrote his address. Nothing would please me more than being able to hire 10 programmers and deluge the hobby market with good software. End quote. So this is his whiny little letter. As the biography kind of glibly notes, nobody started sending him notes with checks or cash saying oops, sorry, you're right, I should pay for the software. But a lot of people did respond saying hey, you are just making up numbers. That $40,000 of computer time is totally arbitrary. Who can afford to do this for 3 years and make no money? Well, clearly you went to Harvard, and you used the computers there to develop it, and those are paid with public money, and a lot of this was developed with public money. And again, this is Gates very early on, but what I think is interesting and telling here is pretty much immediately he starts whining about piracy and this idea of control. And if you stretch back to when he was a kid earlier on, what was he doing? He was doing the same shit. He was hacking stuff. Inevitably in 1980, the first real operating system they come up with is MS-DOS, which is Microsoft Digital Operating System. And that itself, he just bought 86 DOS, which was somebody else's operating system, and then he just changed it a little bit and then sold it as himself. So, it's all the reason why I'm bringing up these little anecdotes is because I think it's telling of, especially eventually as he became this sort of titan in the industry and Microsoft did effectively become a monopoly for a little while, it's all just based out of a crushing business competition. It has nothing to do with the sort of creativity or ingenuity of his product, right? It's a sort of control thing. Now, of course, the thing that eventually would catapult the company and him to mega success was Windows, which was developed in 1985. Hold on, wait. There was one last thing I forgot about MS-DOS that I should mention. The reason why that also ends up being a success in 1980 is because his mom, Mary Giggles, was on the board of IBM at the time and suggested that they used MS-DOS, and so then they got a contract to do that. So again, it shows
good for
how
her.
convenient. Girl boss.
Getting that bag.
Obviously, if you have that opportunity and you want to help your children or whatever, that makes sense. But it's still, it's a demystification again of this idea that somehow he independently did it all himself, right? That he's a self-made billionaire. He's an incredibly well-connected, effectively spoiled rich kid who then gets whiny because people are copying his shitty little computer program. But yeah, like I said, Windows is the thing that eventually catapults them to mega success, and turns them into the world's richest man. man and all of that. But before we talk about like Windows and then the mega success of Microsoft, the last thing I wanted to bring up about his like early life is kind of returning to this relationship with Paul Allen that I'd mentioned a couple of times. So he met Paul Allen when he was a teenager at this private school. They founded Microsoft together. They had done all of their early stuff together. All of the original kind of bits of code or programming that made Microsoft a success, they all worked on together. But would you believe it or not that Gates ends up trying to fuck Paul Allen out of it, out of his share of the company, specifically in 1982 when Paul Allen is diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. And he gets really sick. And he was young when that happened too. He must have been like 29 or 30 years old.
That's awful.
And he gets, effectively cancer. And so he starts going through treatment. And so the last thing I want to read here is just a few bits from Paul Allen's autobiography, which came out not too long ago. But it sort of details like a lot of the fights that him and Gates had, and then this like really, like specifically like horrible moment. Now there was a lot of criticism of his autobiography when it came out, because a lot of people said like, oh, Paul Allen's just bitter that Bill Gates got all the credit and made all the money, which is like, okay,
of course he's bitter. Like
I'm sure he's bitter.
No shit.
And Paul Allen is like a rich, successful guy in his own right, so it's not, and he ends up like beating Hodgkin's, so I don't know, good for him or whatever. It's not like to make it out like he's like perfect in this story either, but his side does reveal, as maybe contested as it is, it does reveal a few things about Bill's character. So I'm going to read here one section. So this is, the context of this is in 1982 at Microsoft when, they're starting to become a real success. Paul Allen has been diagnosed and he's been undergoing chemotherapy at this point. And he's really sick and he can only come into the office a few times a week. And he even says at an earlier point, like, I really should have just taken leave, but there was such a pressure at Microsoft to be there all the time, right? Like, even if you have fucking cancer.
All right.
So anyway, here's a little story. One evening in late December 1982, I heard Bill and Steve, that's Steve Ballmer, who was another executive at Microsoft, speaking heatedly in Bill's office and paused outside to listen in. It was easy to get the gist of the conversation. They were bemoaning my recent lack of production and discussing how they might dilute my Microsoft equity by issuing options to themselves and other shareholders. It was clear that they'd been thinking about this for some time. Unable to stand it any longer, I burst in on them and shouted, "This is unbelievable. It shows your true character, once and for all." I'm not sure Paul Allen said that in exactly those words. That sounds a little like novella-esque. Yeah, but I was speaking to both of them, but staring straight at Bill. Caught red-handed, they were struck dumb. Before they could respond, I turned on my heel and left. I replayed their dialogue in my mind while driving home, and it felt more and more heinous to me. I helped start the company and was still an active member of management, though limited by my illness, and now my partner and my colleague were scheming to rip me off. It was mercenary opportunism, plain and simple. That evening, a chastened Steve Ballmer called my house and asked Jody if he could come over. "Look, Paul," he said after we sat down together, "I'm really sorry about what happened today. We were just letting off steam. We're trying to get so much stuff done, and we just wish you could contribute even more." He's like sick with chemotherapy, as this guy's saying this to him. "But the stock thing isn't fair. I wouldn't have anything to do with it, and I'm sure Bill wouldn't either." I told Steve that the incident had left a bad taste in my mouth. A few days later, I received a 6-page handwritten letter from Bill. Dated December 31st, 1982, the last day of our last full year together at Microsoft. It contained an apology for the conversation I'd overheard, and it offered a revealing Bill's eye view of our partnership. So this is now, I'll just read like the little sections of the letter that he's put out, and again, it gives you a sense of like, think of the context of this. This is supposed to be like Bill's apology to this guy as he has cancer. "During the last 14 years, we have had numerous disagreements. However, I doubt any two partners have ever agreed on as much, both in terms of specific decisions and the general idea of how to view things. Sometimes I think I have more confidence in your abilities than you do. Your strong association with SoftCard always surprises me. Frankly, breakthrough ideas like SoftCard are great, but they're not necessary. The company is really in great shape by some measures. However, the company is in bad shape by one measure. We are a lot less unique than we were before. Our product specs and overall approach is not as unique as they should be. Paul, sometimes I feel like you are telling me I'm a bad guy or that the company is bad. Sometimes I feel like you don't understand all the effort that's gone into the company.
I'm getting flashbacks to when I quit my job and had to meet with my boss about it.
So, again, there's a couple of more little anecdotes from this chapter here. We're running a bit long, so I'm going to just kind of really quick just look at them again and see if they're worth mentioning. But the general vibe is that, you know, he starts getting really hard pushed out, and eventually, like, Bill calls him and tries to say, like, look, I'm just going to buy all your shares at, like, a really low cost. And the guy retorts, like, I'm not going to sell my shares to you at that cost. And they get into a big fight, and eventually he leaves the company. And he does eventually get fucked out of most of his stake in it. And so this is that turning point where then obviously after this, when like Windows comes out and then Bill becomes like whatever, the richest man in the world, but it also shows like, again, this was like his childhood friend.
Right.
This is, and the guy who like, you know, arguably creatively contributed more to the basic things that made Microsoft a success than Bill did. Again, there's sort of competing stories. It's hard to know the truth of what happened, but by most accounts, Bill's success was more as like the marketer of the products. Like he would like travel all over the place. He would like talk up the products. He would sort of package them. And Paul Allen was more the guy who like actually sat down and like did all the work. There's an example like that in here where Paul says like, you know, he brings up a piece of code, like a program that he wrote, and Bill Gates says, you didn't write that, I wrote that. And Paul like feels like gaslighted or whatever, so he goes and he checks, and he's like, he realizes Bill Gates didn't write any of that code, and then he shows it back to Bill Gates, and Bill was like, oh, right, okay, I guess you did write it then.
He's a male manipulator.
I just love also how committed, like before the PR, it's like every story when you really dig of it, it's just him being like, I'm a piece of shit and I'm going to like, not going to pretend otherwise. I will cut your throat and stab your back at the first opportunity I get.
Yeah, exactly. That, you know, another weird thing to that element too, and why I do think there is some truth to like the kind of relationship that probably came from his family and that drove that, right? Is like there are all these like childhood stories always talked about like how competitive the family was, and he did this thing as a kid that was somehow like his family like would set up these like games,
Olympics,
like, outdoor,
they called it.
like like Olympics, and then he did a similar thing when he was in high school. They called it like the Cheerios event or something, where they would like go outside and they would do like stupid triathlon bullshit. And eventually when Microsoft became like a mega hit and they wanted to like do a PR switch, Bill Gates' like great idea was like, what if I make all the employees at Microsoft do this? And so they called them like, I had the name written down somewhere, but they called it like the Microsoft Games.
That's great.
And they would make all the employees come out into this sort of like New England-esque campsite, and then they would have to do like, you know, like they'd do like a running relay, and then like a rowing thing, or like a tricycle, or whatever. Just like this like weird iteration of this stupid thing he did as a child that was all based on like competition. And that's supposed to be like, isn't this like cool and fun and relatable?
It's called team building, okay?
Right. I guess it's the early idea of that, but yeah, that's the setup. That's his beginning. He's just a real weird piece of shit. Ed, I don't know if you wanted to pick up with maybe then talking about Microsoft as a company and how it's evolved since then.
Yeah, I mean, it was made in Bill Gates' image. I think that's a really easy way to understand it, especially at that time. I mean, like I was tempted when structuring this to start with like the 98 antitrust case, but I think also something that gets lost and then focus on the 98 is like Microsoft was already under investigation for a lot of antitrust violations leading up to that moment. Specifically around FTC investigations and DOJ investigations from 91 to 93 and then 93 to 94, right? That didn't result in lawsuits, but then did result in, with the DOJ investigation, did result in like a consent decree, right? And this decree was basically like, okay, Microsoft needs to end these exclusionary contracts, which foreshadow the actual exclusionary anti-competitive practices it did in 98 or was sued over in 98. But basically, one thing that Microsoft had was this thing called a per processor agreement, right? And it had this agreement with computer manufacturers where you would basically pay a royalty to Microsoft, right? So under a per processor license, let's say you're a computer manufacturer, every computer that you sell that has a specific processor, a specific microprocessor at the time, Microsoft gets a royalty from that, regardless of the operating system, right? So if you have Microsoft OS, you get it, a royalty paid out to Microsoft, and if you don't, paid out to Microsoft, and that ends up manifesting, if you think about it, as a sort of tax on non-Microsoft operating systems, right? Because you're not there's no Microsoft on it, and you still have to pay it. So why not just have a Microsoft operating system that you can then get a discount on by buying in bulk or buying in mass or buying exclusively, right? And so the DOJ had found in its statement, like analyzing the situation, that in '93 these agreements accounted for like 60% of all MS-DOS sales to manufacturers and 43% of all the Windows sales to manufacturers, right? And so these contracts eventually become essential to preventing operating system vendors from breaking into the market, right, and closing out competitors. And that was one that I think paints a good picture, a foreshadowing picture of like what Microsoft antitrust holdings, right? There's another one in which it's not supposed to enter, agreement with other firms where they're, it's conditioned basically on the licensing of any product, right, and only relying on Microsoft or only allowing Microsoft products to be offered. So the 95 decree that is issued, puts some restrictions, a horizontal one and a vertical one, right, to prevent I was about to say Amazon. A little Freudian slip, I guess. But it basically steps in to prevent some of these anti-competitive measures, but doesn't actually result in real changes to the business model, right? Because it's still doing what antitrust lawyers in the DOJ and then 20 other states in 98 allege, which is that it's violating the Sherman Act, specifically Section 2, by creating exclusionary agreements that prevent competitors from entering into a market. And so the Sherman Act is just like, it's an old law. It's an antitrust law, one of the earliest and in some cases strongest or more easily to apply to strong scenarios antitrust law back in 1890, right? And it is pretty explicit in that section about banning a company from excluding other companies from operating in business. Nonetheless, right, that is what Amazon, I keep saying Amazon. Oh my God. Nonetheless, that's what Microsoft ends up doing, right? And so they draw the IRV, the DOJ, 20 state attorneys, in an investigation that kicks off almost 2 decades of nonstop antitrust litigation, right? Microsoft gets sued or gets investigated by the European Commission, right, in 98 over whether or not it's preventing its operating systems from being interoperable after a complaint that is launched by Sun Microsystems, right? And then the European Commission investigates them again in 2000 for trying to see if Microsoft is tying its other products to its operating system so that it can prevent competitors from being more widely used, even if they don't have their own operating system, because Windows is dominant and Windows is the major browser, it's the major operating system at the time. In Europe continues to go. Europe has its own set of investigations. I'll just list some of them off. In 2004, right, they also have some regulators that, after an investigation level, I think like a $500 million euro fine on Microsoft for not, allowing rivals to access data that's generated from some of its products, and then also for the earlier mentioned, tying of some of its products to the operating system. Another fine comes in 2006, right, when about 300 million euros, again, when it fails to comply with the demands of the 2004 Commission order to provide the data to its competitors, right? And more investigations, another 2 investigations, one into interoperability, another one into browser choice, right? And then these result in landmark, I think probably some of the largest fines in in EU history, one that's almost 900 million euros.
Damn,
and another, yeah, I know, right? And they could have, and also another thing is they could have gone for more. They could have gone for 10% of Microsoft's revenue, which would have been, I think at the time, or in either 2009 or 2013, they could have gone for 10% of the revenue, which would have been $7 billion, but they decided not
Jesus
to.
Christ.
Did you imagine a $7 billion fine at the time? I mean, the goal with these fines, they wanted to deter, but Microsoft kept ignoring this shit.
Of course, because they can afford it, right? Why wouldn't they ignore it?
Because they can afford it, and because the Europeans were being pretty aggressive with the antitrust action, but the United States was not matching the same sort of energy, right? In the United States, you had the the Justice Departments and the 20 state attorneys, right, suing Microsoft in '98, and then this dragging on to a district judge Thomas Penfield Jackson, who, in April writes his decision where he's like, okay, it's very obvious that Microsoft violated the Sherman Act. They're using anti-competitive practices. They're maintaining a monopoly. They're using their power to dominate the web browser market, right? And that it's tying the web browser market to Windows. And so about a month later, he's like, okay, let's just break up Microsoft into two companies, right? And almost does, or at least, for a second, it seems like Microsoft is then going to be broken up into two separate companies. And so they tried to appeal the case, to kick it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refuses to hear the appeal from Microsoft, right, and shoots it back down to a lower court, to the Federal Appeals Court in D.C., where after some time, the the Justice Department.
It should be the Defense Department.
Right, but it's Capitol Defense Department, right?
Yeah, right.
And at this point, it's 2001. Bush is president, and the DOJ says, actually, we don't want to break up Microsoft. We think that we can do a settlement. But the settlement result kind of opens the door, I think, for a long series for the next few decades of constant antitrust complaints. Antitrust complaints from Time Warner over the net, or again over Netscape, right? Which AOL Time Warner had acquired, I think, in 2001 or 2002. You have Sun Microsystems, right? You have private litigation. You have class action lawsuits from litigants that are trying to expand the amount of people that can sue Microsoft, saying that it prevented them from getting some product out. And all of this results in Microsoft trying to radically, in the press release, say they're radically changing the business so that they can comply with this settlement, and also so that there's not as much anti-competitive practices, right? Now, when you open Windows and you go to your internet browser, right, you can hide other Microsoft programs so that you can see the competition and see if you like them and see if you want to use them, right? And so this works for some time, but this is a complaint that continues to appear over time. The EU actually sues Microsoft years later over the failure to actually do this very thing, which they insist they would, right? They got fined about 561 million euros in 2013 for insisting, okay, we had this browser choice screen pop up and we were going to introduce it in 2010. And it was part of compliance with the earlier EU investigation that said we weren't allowing competitors to have their products offered, in one way or another, or viewable by the consumer in one way or another. And so when you pull up, you're supposed to see, okay, what browser do you want? Do you want Firefox? Do you want Microsoft? Do you want Opera? Do you want Chrome? Do you want Internet Explorer? But then they took it out in a certain update, and so they got sued, and they, lost, obviously, and had to pay up a fine. But the activity and the behavior continues and goes on, where Microsoft is faced with a regulatory watchdog saying, right, you're sitting here and you're leveraging, the use of your web browser, you're leveraging the use of your products that you're tying into your web browser, and you're insisting that competitors don't get any data or any access to the data that you're generating from your products or that you're getting from your consumers, and so that's anti-competitive, and we're going to fine you, and you need to stop. And they say, okay, we'll stop, and then they do it again in a few months, and then they get fined again, right, and then they do it again. But I think that dispelling all that, or at least like moving a little bit back from all of that, the antitrust case in 98 is important as kicking off all of this because it is the origin of, I think, a pretty consistent set of arrogant arguments that are offered usually by big tech and like form the structure of most of big tech's discussion, right? So the argument that antitrust regulation is anti-innovation, right? The idea that if you were to break up Microsoft, the idea that if you were to force Microsoft from blocking competitive vendors, if you were to force Microsoft to spin off its other products, then you would undermine innovation because the reason why people are choosing these things, the reason why people are choosing Microsoft is because Microsoft has created something special inside of this walled garden and that there's no real competition. If it was competition, it would have broken through and it would have succeeded. I think that, one thing it is interesting to think about is what would have happened, right? If Microsoft had ended up getting broken up into two companies, as Jackson had initially proposed, right? One for the operating system and one for all the products, because that would have also structured some of the lessons that we're taking away with these other companies, right, today in antitrust discussions, right, where we're thinking about whether or not to spin them off or not, but even talking about spinning them off seems a little bit naive, right? Right. But the antitrust, I think, case also sets the stage. I think one of the defenses that people use of it is that, breaking Microsoft's hold on browsers allowed for other companies to rise up. It allowed for Google to rise up, right? It allowed for Facebook and Amazon to rise up ostensibly. It's supposed to have allowed for a new generation of tech companies that are now even more fearsome and dangerous and powerful to take its place. And that's good. Or it was good until right. And I think that honestly, they should have just killed Microsoft. They killed Microsoft, and sold it for spare parts. Maybe, things might be different. But it's also interesting to step back and look, because I think that's one of Microsoft's antitrust cases from the government are some of the last major wins in antitrust cases for the government, right? It's from there that enforcement drops radically, right? There were maybe from like the 70s to 99 or 2000, like about a dozen monopoly cases every single year were brought before the government or tried by the government. And after the Microsoft case, you see a steep drop, right? And it goes down to, 2 or 3 each year on average. Part of that is because a lot of companies learned that there are certain things you just should not say, right, or do because of the case, right? Google, for example, in its antitrust case that it's dealing with right now, that mirrors some of Microsoft's, the arguments in the case and uses Microsoft's case precedent, learned and internally would talk about how, you have the chief economist saying, do not say the word cutting off, or the phrase cutting off air supply. And then that was a phrase that Microsoft used to talk about how it was going to treat Netscape, the other, web browser that they were trying to kill. You weren't supposed to use the word bundle. You weren't supposed to use the word kill. You weren't supposed to use language, and employees were instructed to avoid using language that would suggest that there was an orchestrated attempt to undermine competition. And at the same time, you're also supposed to avoid language that would suggest there's dominance, right? Which prefigures a lot of the way that Facebook and Amazon and Google talk about their thing, right? Here, you're not supposed to say market power. At least in Google, you weren't supposed to say market power, because when Microsoft did speak about it, they got shot in the foot, and it was used as evidence against them. Whereas these other firms, when they do talk about market power, what do they like to say? They like to say we're 1% of the global market, right? We're 2% of the global market. We're 5% of the global market, ignoring that they're like 90% of the U.S. market in a specific category. Right.
Quick question. Yeah. If in those, kind of, I'm assuming there has to be this, I don't know, like an internal memo or whatever that goes out, like here's like a list of approved phrases, unapproved phrases. Is there any indication that you are still allowed to use language like, we want to kill the competition, if you then follow it up by saying parody, non-actionable in Minecraft? I mean,
right? No, that only applies to leftists.
Okay, all right. Legally, that's the distinction.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, if you're a capitalist, there's a higher standard.
Right. Okay.
But I think that's also a good question in that, for these companies, as we saw with the Google and the Facebook antitrust lawsuits, right? A lot of them took lessons from the Microsoft and what language to avoid, but then also because of how things have changed with these markets and the type of technologies that we're dealing with, have done things that they probably didn't realize were just as incredibly illegal and collusive, or did and just thought there was no precedent, so they wouldn't be taken to task for it, right? Whether that is orchestrating, a conspiracy to suppress wages in Silicon Valley, whether that's to create a pretty restrictive NDA system, or whether that's to agree to not poach workers from specific places and instead focus on others. These sorts of agreements, informal or formal, result in exclusionary practices, or result in anti-competitive practices, or result in lowering the labor or the values of the labor that these workers provide, and are all conspiratorial in one way or another, right? But they try to shield them either by not speaking about the language, or by doing them informally, or when they do them formally, thinking of them as something else entirely, right? We're not conspiring to lower the wages of the workers. We're working to create a rational market for their labor, so that we can all be better off, right? There are also, I think, a few lessons that come or extend a little bit further, which is that out of the antitrust case, that initial 98 antitrust case, and also all of the antitrust cases that stretch forward, right? This comes in the period where the consumer welfare standard ideology is consolidated, right? And most of the way in which antitrust is measured, thought about, spoken about, and thought through is this idea of how much harm is it causing consumers? Are the prices better or lower, right? And Microsoft, I think, is a good example of a situation in which the price of the product, or one of the early examples of when a tech company's price for its product doesn't actually tell you really anything about what it's doing to other competitors into the market, right? When you have the case of Netscape, right? And these two are competing for market share inside of the browser market, right? One of the tactics that Microsoft used, right, of course, was bundling, Internet Explorer, bundling Windows, Media Player, all of these products. But doing that, bundling is not simply just like giving it to, I think bundling, most people think of it, they just think of like ease of access, and that's the main problem. But also the problem is like there's no additional cost, right? It's zero. It costs $0 additional, 0 cents to add it together, right? Whereas for the competitors, it will cost $5 plus the $5 plus the $5 and so on and so forth. And so the price upfront doesn't immediately reflect the harm that it does, or the way in which it can restructure the marketplace. And that in of itself, I mean, not a lesson that people are still working with, because I still think there's a fanatic obsession over the upfront prices, especially when with Amazon as one example. But with Microsoft, a lot of the problems that we see today in discussing antitrust and the limitations that we come across are prefigured in that Microsoft antitrust battle, and returned to us today because they haven't been resolved, and because that was the last major case, right? They were able to avoid a breakup thanks to Bush, but they were also able to avoid real, punishing fines and restructuring and regulation that would follow from it to prevent them from doing the type of changes. Instead, they self-regulated, and instead they ate a bunch of fines in the EU for things that they promised they would have stopped in 2004 and 2006 and 2009 and 2013, right?
The second worst thing Bush did in 2001. Ed, you mentioned earlier...
It's a few days before 9/11, too.
Oh my
damn.
God. I'm adding a new thread of yarn on the giant corkboard I have in my room.
Yeah, actually, I think the memos might have been in Tower 7. Don't quote me.
You mentioned earlier too, like the attitude that Microsoft put forward, right, when sort of confronted with even just the general charge of like monopoly behavior, right, or like you're an evil corporate behemoth, is like, no, like we make like a special product, like that's why like people like this, In one of the docs we watched, and I'll see if I can find this, and if you can cut this in, but there's like an interview with Bill Gates in the 90s where he's like playing up up the geek angle, and he says almost exactly the words you use. He's like, I'm not like some evil guy. Like Microsoft makes like a really nice product. It's a really great thing, and if people want to buy it, they want to buy it, and if they don't want to buy it, they don't buy it.
I mean, we're not like an alligator. We don't go around and eat things. I mean, we come out with these little boxes, these nice little software packages, and you stick them in your computer, and you either have fun using it, and it helps you get things done, or not.
And it's part, like, I think in thinking about the Titan and like and the real like again, the kind of like domineering place that Microsoft and Gates have, right, is like the whole idea then of cultivating this other kind of version of it, right? The cultivation of this personality is in part, like, while it probably does stem from a genuine, like, I'm sure Bill Gates literally is just like a weird nerd, but it's also, it's like it's a certain kind of like playing it up, right? It's like it's a different one than maybe like some other kind of corporate models of like how you play up your personality. But at that point, that was like, I'm gonna play up like I'm just like the nerdy guy.
I'm
like,
harmless.
I'm not a villain. Yeah. I'm a little guy just running around, you know, like.
Yeah, you know, I think that battle also like directly influenced the way in which PR was handled for Bill Gates later on, and then for Microsoft later on, because Microsoft has evaded a lot of criticism over the years and is widely regarded, it's regarded in one way or another as like this darling, even though, you know, it has a $22 billion contract with the military, right, to do HoloLens, even though its supply chain has child laborers and child slaves in the Congo, you know, even though it is still doing or has been recently violating antitrust, or is being accused of violating antitrust law, even though it is working with ICE, you know, on the DHS, even though it is doing all of these things, it's still darling because it learned if you want to avoid antitrust scrutiny, you need to cultivate a relationship with the public in one way or another, and the government, right? There's a reason why they went from being the subject of multiple decades-long antitrust inquiries to one of the largest lobbyists in the federal government in the European Union, and also a company that presents itself as a advocate for smart and responsible public policy, right?
There was too in that era, right? There was like, and again, the one of the documentaries that we watched, it was a fairly glowing one of Gates, right? But you could see through the cracks that, like, you know, coincidentally around this time is also around the time when, like, you know, Bill Gates would do more of these like kind of public appearances, right? These sort of like pre-TED Talk, like product launch kind of things that then became the standard in Silicon Valley, you know, where you go out on a stage and you get everybody excited and like, here's a new thing that's going to come out. And there was one, I think it was when they did Windows 98, where they had like Jay Leno,
Really?
like co-host like the launch of Windows 98, and so, you know, Bill Gates gets on stage, and if you could cut this in, but he says like,
Windows 95 is so easy, even a talk show host can figure it out.
you know, he has like a little canned line where he's like, Microsoft Windows 98 is so easy, even a talk show host can use it. And Jay Leno's like, wah, wah. And it's like, but that is like, you know, that's not incidental, right? Like that this is where that kind of turn starts to happen. And again, even just anecdotally, you know, like for me growing up in the 90s and then the 2000s, I remember, you know, there was this, like the vague notion of like, oh, Bill Gates, like evil nerd villain, super villain. Like that's how he was maybe, you know, shown in like a lot of, you know, I don't know, cultural parodies and stuff or jokes about him or whatever. But then there was this like shift to like benevolent, like master. Savior. Savior complex guy. And, you know, and again, I was never somebody that was particularly on my radar, and I never really thought about it that much when I was growing up, but there was that shift that happened. And, you know, if I remember it that way, right, and I think a lot of people, the way that you just like get these things through cultural osmosis, it comes to you, right? Like that's because they put like a shitload of money,
of course,
in order to manage and cultivate that thing, and then that's effectively what he does then when he leaves Microsoft and turns into like Mr. Philanthropy, right? Like richest man in the world. Now it's time for me to do even more evil shit, but he killed it in some way or another. And Carrie, I think you had some stuff about his great philanthropic work.
Yeah, do you want me to get into that
with
now?
all of his money. Yeah.
Okay.
As I understand, his fortune has been getting smaller and smaller every year because he's giving
Wow.
it away.
Good for him. I'm gonna take a giant sip of my milkshake and listen.
I think at one point, like last year, he became the richest man again, like momentarily.
Yeah.
Because of the fluctuations and like stock stuff because of COVID. But he's like in the top 10.
It's always
rich.
going
like,
up. It's never like reduced.
Yeah.
I forget over what time
so
period
funny.
it was, but it was like it doubled over the same period that he was like pledging to give away all his money.
No, guys, I promise. I'll give it all away. I'm gonna die in 30 years, but I'm gonna quadruple it.
As soon as I die, but then secretly I'm also investing in like, immortality drugs or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah, right.
I promise.
I'm gonna hit $1 trillion and I'll give it away and it'll be great.
So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about like the good billionaire image that he's tried to cultivate with like the philanthropic efforts that he funnels obscene amounts of money into. And I think an interesting tidbit that we saw earlier, Shane, in one of the biography videos we were watching, was that his mom was kind of like a civic leader, kind of philanthropy-focused person, and he launches his first foundation the same year that she dies. And the way that it was framed was like he's taking up the mantle of like the family philanthropy or whatever. He started the William...
No more giggles.
No more giggles. Rest in peace, giggles.
That was the day my smile died.
Tonight, a comedian died.
So he launches the William H. Gates Foundation in 1994, and this is the foundation that eventually merges with the Gates Learning Foundation to form the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? So as I was like reading about this, I was trying to think about how I wanted to frame it, and I am going to talk a little bit about like the foundation and its goals, but there's like one particular kind of case study that I think really puts all of his work into context and like the effects that it has and what its actual goals are. So just to start, according to the foundation itself, what are its goals, right? Just a couple of quotes from their own website. From poverty to health to education, our areas of focus offer the opportunity to dramatically improve the quality of life for billions of people. So we build partnerships that bring together resources, expertise, and vision, working with the best organizations around the globe to identify issues, find answers, and drive change. We focus on issues we think are the biggest barriers that prevent people from making the most of their lives. For each issue we work on, we fund innovative ideas that could help remove barriers. Some of the projects we fund will fail. We not only accept that, we expect it.
Cool.
Because we think an essential role of philanthropy is to make bets on promising solutions that governments and businesses can't afford to make. As we learn which bets pay off, we adjust our strategies and share the results so everyone can benefit. So that kind of gives you a preview of like the sort of business-oriented type of approach that they take to this. They view everything as kind of like investments. But, what this translates into is the foundation funds existing initiatives. They give money to governments. They create their own spin-off initiatives and foundations. And they partner with a number of organizations and businesses in areas that they deem of interest: education, healthcare, poverty, sanitation, etc. The one that I came across that I thought was interesting, I was just like looking at the list of things that they fund, and I noticed that the thing that they fund the most, like far and away the most, is something called Gavi, and I wasn't familiar with it. Some people might be familiar with it because it's been in the news a bit with COVID, but it's like far and away the first. Like they give it twice as much money as they give to the World Health Organization. And what Gavi is, it was formerly known as hold on, let me get that right. It was formerly known as the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. Now it just goes by Gavi. And this is something that they provided the seed money for. I believe it was in 1999. It was officially founded in January of 2000. And their focus, as the name implies, is global immunization, particularly focusing on poor countries. It's a public-private global health partnership.
I love that phrase.
Yeah.
public-private global health partnership. It just exudes so much confidence and security.
Yeah, you already know that it's good. Like, how can it be bad, right?
Yeah.
I hear, like, I get, like, an image of, like, Littlefinger in Game of Thrones. Being like, friend gave me an opportunity. Something that's never been tried before.
COVID is a ladder.
Oh, God. So as I started looking into this, I felt like this was like a really good case study in what happens when billionaires start like helping in fields that are really not their area of expertise at all, and the type of solutions that they give. And, you know, he at this point is meddling in so many things that it is just easier to talk about like one example instead of trying to cover all of it. And I'm just going to assume this is the same approach to everything, right? And what I want to focus on is the relationship between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gavi, and how that relationship affects public health, and then how it also guides the conversation around public health at the highest levels, because it is really insane the amount of influence that they have. So, like I said, this was started with a pledge of $750 million from Bill and Melinda Gates. Over time, they've given Gavi $4 billion. Their main goal, vaccinating children in poor countries, like I said. And what they follow is what a few authors call the Gates approach to global health, which is very businesslike. Yeah, it's very like businesslike, tech-oriented, hyper-focused on specific issues, and it's very market-oriented with a very, very strong focus on quantifiable results. They want numbers that they can show to their donors and to the world to show how good they are, right? Just really quickly, some criticisms they've received. They give private donors too much control over global health goals. They prioritize new expensive vaccines versus ensuring global access to existing vaccines that we already know there's a need for. They disrupt local health systems with targeted initiatives that don't take into account, you know, the specifics of the locality they're throwing stuff at. They partner with major pharmaceutical companies, and that results in overpaying for vaccines and giving them insane subsidies that they really don't need to be getting. And part of that is probably because they have people from pharmaceutical companies on their board. Because it's a public-private partnership, they have their board is comprised of people from governments, people from public organizations, and, you know, just people from Pfizer or whatever. Why not? Just get them in there. So a couple of criticisms that came directly from Doctors Without Borders of two of their initiatives illustrate how these issues and criticisms play out. The first one is about GVAP, which is the Global Vaccine Action Plan. And this was the thing where they were telling them, like, you're focused on this new initiative, right? But you're ignoring the 20% of the world's children don't have access to basic vaccines, and that with the money and resources you have, you could immediately fix that, and you're not doing it. And this is a criticism that Doctors Without Borders has leveled against them multiple times. They're like, hey, this is what we need. You know, people that are on the ground are saying, this is what we need. And they're just like, no, don't worry about it. Pfizer needs $300 million from us to do this other thing. So we're busy. The other thing is related to the pneumococcal. Is that the right way to say pneumococcal? Does anybody know pneumococcal?
How's it spelled?
Pneumococcal.
It's like,
not a real word.
It's the vaccine.
Yeah,
it's like the vaccine they give to kids. I'm going to say pneumococcal.
Unanimous approval.
Got it.
Pneumococcal.
You could even change it each time. You know?
Pneumococcal.
I would.
So the other thing is related to the pneumococcal advanced market commitment. And at the time of the article that I read, which I think was like 2011 or 2012, so it's more than 20 years now, infants in wealthy countries have benefited from a pneumococcal vaccine, and two improved versions were introduced in Europe and the US in 2009 and 2010. The AMC was meant to bring this vaccine that can prevent millions of occurrences of disease and death to poorer countries. So the issue here was the financing for that program. This is what Doctors Without Borders was kind of criticizing. The big winners in this were actually GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer. They received $225 million each in subsidies, as well as $10.50 per child that was vaccinated.
Oh.
Which is like way more than normally should be paid for that, by the way. The board chair at the time stated that he would welcome future participation of developing country manufacturers as part of our pressure on the industry to bring prices down, which, by the way, is not something that they've ever done. It's been like a stated goal that they've had. It has never actually successfully happened. And Doctors Without Borders pointed out, this is like a really nice thing to say, but they have a conflict of interest that makes it very difficult to actually do this, which is, again, they have vaccine producers with seats on their board. Like, what motivation could they possibly have to do that?
I think the $10.50 or whatever per kid thing really just hit me, because it's like, I mean, again, like you're saying, it's like quantifying everything into like sort of market logic, right?
Yes,
and it's like, I mean, it's like seeing sick or needy children as an opportunity to make money, right? Like that's what the charity ends up doing,
and that is how they frame it, like internally, and even when they frame things to like donors, like they frame it as like, you're getting the best bang for your buck by giving us money because we can quantify the results. It really is what they do.
I want to make sure when I'm an incredibly wealthy person, but is my charity money getting the bang for my buck?
Is this the best value?
Yeah, I don't know.
So again, I just have like a little list here of like all the times Doctors Without Borders has called on them to like reduce prices so that they can make more effective use of their money. Because again, they have like more money than God, right? Like they can,
What they would do.
Like, they can fix a lot of problems, and they're basically choosing not to. So in 2015, they call for them again to please lower it to $5, which is a normal, like even competitive price in the market. Just stop giving GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer so much money, please. They don't do it. In 2019, they asked them to stop giving the subsidies to the pharmaceutical companies, which they called a duopoly, and instead buy the vaccine from a new manufacturer, which was the Serum Institute of India. They offered the same vaccine at 2/3 of the price. So this vaccine actually makes up 40% of Gavi's vaccine purchasing costs, and a 33% price drop, which is what they were offered, would save them literally billions of dollars. But they chose not to do that. Again, they just ignored Doctors Without Borders, I guess. In 2020, they appealed again for Gavi to bulk buy the cheaper pneumococcal vaccine and vaccinate more of the 55 million children who are not vaccinated with it. I mean, think also, like, even if they like kept going to like Pfizer and GlaxoSmithKline, if they reduced it to like $5, that's still 5 times 55 million. It's still like an insane amount of money.
Right. But is it the most you can squeeze out of needy children?
Right. So to further contextualize this, I ended up finding a really interesting paper from a medical anthropologist. Her name is Katerini T. Storing. And she didn't talk so much about the actual operating practices of Gavi or like their day-to-day or their structure. She investigated more how they end up guiding that conversation and guiding the processes that they're involved in just on a global scale. And I want to make clear, because I might say stuff about the horrible things I'm about to talk about, that she does not say any of this is evil. She's a very good researcher. She's just doing an ethnographic study about the relations between these people. I believe she did this from 2010 to 2012. She got to sit in on like board meetings at Gavi and various other organizations. I think she said that she was privy to like a meeting between Bill Gates and the Norwegian Prime Minister. So she really had access to like a lot of high level people and really got a feel for like what was going on at Gavi. And some of the stuff that I'm going to say is just going to say like a researcher or an expert. And that's because a lot of the people that she spoke to, she anonymized, because they're people who are still in the public health sphere. And if they said anything about Bill Gates, they would just be like kicked out of their jobs, basically.
Right.
So she gets a bit deeper than the Doctors Without Borders critiques. And the crux of what she gets into is that kind of Gates approach to public health, which is like the very techno-oriented, like single disease kind of focus. You know, we're going to wipe out one disease in one area. That's like one camp and one approach in the public health sphere. And then there is health system strengthening. That's the other approach, which has more of a focus on like building infrastructure, continuity of care, primary care for countries that don't have those resources. One thing that came up a lot in the critiques that I read about Gavi, and that comes up in this and in the Doctors Without Borders stuff, is that the way that Gavi ends up doing things is they will just like, dump tens of thousands of vaccines on an area that doesn't really have like the infrastructure to support that without taking a hit to its local healthcare system. They don't have the staff, the resources, the time to like all of a sudden be administering all these vaccines without additional help. So obviously it would probably make a little bit of sense to strengthen those healthcare systems before you take on these like huge initiatives to eradicate one specific thing. But it is like they have like a very, very single-minded focus. And the interesting thing is that she uses to illustrate how they guide the conversation is that because Gavi received so much criticism for this, for their opposition or their supposed opposition to health system strengthening, they ended up adopting it as one of their goals. And what happened as a result is that has kind of like the definition of it and what it means has like shifted. They're not actually doing anything. They've just put it in their like, their list of like goals and initiatives now. And now they actually, like it's mentioned a couple of times in the paper at conferences that this person went to, they're like praised for it. They're like, it's so great that Gavi is focused on health system strengthening now, even though they literally have done nothing to do that.
It's just in a PowerPoint now.
Yes.
And everybody applauds.
It's a line in a PowerPoint. Literally, that's literally what it is.
God, that sucks so fucking bad.
It sucks really bad, yeah. And it is like a really, like in the public health sphere, it's like a really, really heated debate. And the reason in part that they added it to their goals is that between 2004 and 2010, they had a guy running Gavi, Julian Lobb-Levitt, who was someone who was a genuine advocate for it. He really believed in health system strengthening. He didn't think that this single-minded focus on one thing was the way to really fix global health issues. And, there were people around him that also believed that. There came to be like two camps within Gavi itself. And eventually he was, pushed out because of that. That is the reason that he ended up leaving, because Bill Gates is extremely, extremely, extremely against this. The foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, strongly resists it. It's because the reality is it is more difficult to measure than saying we got X amount of vaccines to this region over X amount of time. What that quantitative approach leaves out is, like I said, the disruption to local health systems, which they don't even quantify that. And another critique that an anonymous public health person said to this person is that they refuse to even try to measure the harm that they're doing. Like people internally have asked them, like, okay, well, even if you're going to like do it this way, can we at least try to measure like any kind of disruption that we're causing to the local systems when we're doing this? And they just like absolutely refuse to do it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very smart.
We love data.
Why would you do
right.
that?
We love data except when it's bad about us. We don't want that.
It's not real. It's not real.
Yeah. So these are just, this is like a quote that I pulled from the paper that this person wrote. The Gates Foundation was a very loud, vocal voice saying that we do not believe in the strengthening of health systems, said one of Gavi's strongest health systems proponents, recalling that Bill Gates often told him in private conversations that he is vehemently against health systems. He basically said it is a complete waste of money.
He's just against hospitals.
Yeah.
What? What kind of Randian shit is this?
He basically said it is a complete waste of money and that there is no evidence that it works. So I will not see a dollar or cent of my money go to the strengthening of health systems.
What?
Yeah.
This is so. Everyone, we all right. You all just we have to lay in hammocks and tourniquets and like broken down buildings. And if you get scurvy, then someone shoots money at you until the problem is done.
Yes.
And you have to pay back the money they shot.
Yes.
That's the ideal system.
That's the way that it should work. So again, like while they adopted this as one of their goals, like in the background, it's just like always been bullshit. They've never actually done anything. It's just like another way that they manipulate the conversation to make it seem like they're kind of doing the right thing, but they're really just doing whatever is, again, getting that like bang for the buck for their donors and giving money to companies like Pfizer.
And then at the same time, too, like reaping the sort of public relations benefit of being like, look how much money we give to these causes. Here's this pretty graph.
Look how many vaccines we give. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And it's a way to like create the illusion of doing like public good without doing public good.
The really sad thing that paper gets into is that the Gates approach was very much like US focused, right? Other countries did go more towards the health system strengthening approach, but through so many years of like lobbying and trying to like manipulate that conversation, now other countries are coming around to this approach instead.
Of course.
So he's frequently depicted as an extreme expression of like the technical bias of US thinking about health systems. And this is another little quote I pulled. They're obsessed with this, commented one UK-based vaccine expert with strong global level policy ties. And I think it is Mr. Gates himself who sort of believes that the world can be cured by technology. So it's like a classic tech guy thing, right? It's like tech solutionism. He really thinks that like we just need to solve this problem. It's so easy. So in addition to the actual initiatives that they fund, they're trying to influence public policy. For instance, through research funding and lobbying, the foundation has encouraged the international maternal health community to focus on magic bullets like antibiotics to prevent maternal death, despite maternal health specialists' insistence that general health system strengthening is required to reduce maternal mortality. So that was just another example here where there's actually data showing what needs to be done in order to fix this. But because the Gates approach is we need a single like focus on a magic bullet to fix something, we're just going to throw antibiotics at like the global problem of maternal mortality. Another example of this is a British public health expert that this researcher spoke to was saying that the UK government has recently, quote, moved away from health system strengthening after very heavy lobbying from the Gates Foundation and the conservative opposition. And now they're very much aligned with the Gates line of thinking. So whereas before they were more on the side of like, you know, our money needs to go to strengthening these systems, now they're more like, let's throw some vaccines and antibiotics at them. And the UK, the US, Norway, and there's one other country besides the Gates Foundations are the biggest contributors to Gavi. So it really makes a big difference here. Like there is a very close relationship between government officials and like the board of Gavi, basically. So what's the takeaway? On the surface, you have an organization that's doing good, right? They're giving vaccinations and stuff.
End of story.
It.
It's just
they're so good. They're so good. But
thank you so much, Bill and Melinda.
We love you so much.
Thank you, Mom and Dad.
Please send me $10,000.
Thank you, Giggles Jr.
The reality is, because the money and power is so concentrated, not just in public-private partnerships, but really at the highest level in individual actors with outsized influence and little expertise in public health, you end up with ineffective or sometimes actively harmful public policy and initiatives. Not only that, but over time, their outsized influence affects policy that would normally be outside the sphere of people like Bill Gates or other donors to the foundation, right? They wouldn't normally be able to reach that. The conversation that they shape with their money and social power ends up guiding the actions of governments, while organizations like Gavi and the Gates Foundation funnel money into corporations under the guise of doing what they think is best for the world, because they're just good people, right? At the end of the day, it's not really a focus on improving global health. It's, like I said, that bang for the buck for donors and, you know, giving money to like their corporate partners. And it's not only an unsustainable model, but it's also one that lends itself to all kinds of manipulation and insulation from debate. One of the last things that author gets into is that Bill Gates and consequently the foundation itself has like an air of uncriticizability around him, is the word that she used. Like nobody wants to fuck with him. Somebody that she spoke to that worked at Gavi said that before he would visit the headquarters, they would take down the posters that mentioned health system strengthening so that he wouldn't get upset. Because he gets like violently upset if somebody agrees with him. He like really strongly
starts huffing and puffing.
So again, Gavi is just like one piece of the puzzle, but it kind of illustrates how the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation operates, right? And it also illustrates the problems with this mode of philanthropy, and you can easily see how the application of this logic to other areas could lead to problems. And what I thought about when I was like writing these notes, Jane, was what we were talking about the other day of the one laptop per child thing, which is kind of a similar thing of like, let's just throw technology at these kids, and then it like never really worked. And it's just deemed as a failure. And, you know, that was deemed as a failure over a pretty short period of time, and there's still like a little bit of debate about it. But like Bill Gates has so much more money and influence than the guy who did that. Like the scale for us to realize that this stuff that he's doing is a failure is going to be such a much longer timeline, and the damage that they're doing to health systems and probably like education systems and other systems over that period of time is like incalculable, when the reality is they do have the money to fix a lot of those problems, and they're just like making things exponentially worse.
I mean, it also gets into, you know, what Ed was talking about, and you know what I had brought up a little bit in terms of like just his character, where it's like it's a mode remote of control, right? Like, it's not really about doing social good or wanting to help.
Right.
It's about, like, maintaining, because if you wanted to help, you just give the money away.
Right.
You just give it to, which is, I guess, the crux of, like, the health system stuff, right? You just, like, give hospitals money. Just, like, here's $100 million for, you know,
whatever you need in your hospital.
XYZ hospital. Yeah. And you can build it up, and we'll come back in a year and see, you know, how that went or whatever.
Or, like, let us know what else you need. Right,
exactly. Or why don't you tell us what you need and we'll procure it for you? And you could even still do, like, a horrible capitalist profit sharing scheme in that, right? You could still make fucking money.
Right. I mean, it's the classic tech guy thing of, like, I know what's best for you just because I'm, like, a tech genius.
Or also it's because, like, this thing I like is the best thing because
That's
I
right.
like it.
Right. What other reason could there be? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I had to talk about just really briefly was something we talked about the other day, Shane, which was the Giving Pledge. And that was something that he formed with his wife and Warren Buffett, who he's actually close friends with.
They're third.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I mean, this has gotten a lot of publicity. It's like, you might have heard about this.
Him being the third.
Yeah. He's their unicorn. So the Giving Pledge is like a commitment. It's a fake commitment that they had, like, the world's wealthiest individuals and families sign.
Well, hey, now Warren Buffett, he's given all his money away. Don't forget that. He's not,
but not his
rich anymore. Yeah.
So they it's a pledge to give the majority of their money away, right? Which of course they've done. That's the end of the story. No, they're also worth billions of dollars, but they pledged collectively $600 billion if they ever actually keep that promise. And almost none of the signees have as yet made any progress towards doing that.
Well, I'm sure they'll get around to it.
Since the pledge was created in 2010, the wealth of the donors has not decreased, but has instead increased from a combined $376 billion in 2010 to a combined $734 billion in 2020.
It's just good things come your way when you do good things. You know, you
That's
give your money away and you end up with $400 billion more.
I think they're waiting for $1 trillion. Once they hit
That's
$1
when
trillion,
they're really going to do it. We have to give them a chance.
They're going to give it away.
And the interesting thing is many of them who have made big donations have done so to private foundations, and their families are on the payroll of that, you know, and also they get, like, tax breaks for doing that. But my little secret reason for bringing up that was the connection to Warren Buffett. And I told you about this, Shane, and I think I posted about it when I first saw it. And this will be lighter. It'll be less bleak than the other stuff. I used to have a TV that would start playing this network, Cheddar TV, when I wasn't using it, almost as like a screensaver. And one day, a TV show came on, and it was a cartoon. I was like, this is so weird. What is this? Because there was a cartoon Warren Buffett in it. That's what made me be like, what is going on? Warren Buffett has a TV show called The Secret Millionaires Club. And it is a TV show.
It takes place on Little St. James Island.
This is a great segue for Chris. So this is like it's a TV show, and the idea of the TV show is that Warren Buffett acts as like a mentor to like this group of like 4 or 5 kids, and they're like little robot friend, and they're like entrepreneurial kids, and he like helps them go to places.
Do they solve mysteries? Is it like Scooby-Doo?
No. They solve global problems.
Okay.
Do they fight Thanos?
Yeah, that's a global problem.
That's right.
They could solve that.
Coincidentally.
They fight Killmonger.
So yeah, it's called The Secret Millionaires Club, and coincidentally, that episode that I happened to catch had Bill Gates in it. A cartoon Bill Gates shows up, and I believe it is voiced by Bill Gates himself, because I looked up the episode before this just to hear it, and it did sound like him. And you know, they express that they're like best friends, and he introduces Bill Gates to the kids, who are all huge fans of him. One kid asks for his autograph, and then I will just read you the title of the episode and the description, and I'll leave it at that. The episode is called The Gift. The Secret Millionaires Club kids visit an African village with a challenge from Bill Gates to be inventive and problem solve the lack of electricity, so the locals can take advantage of computers and the internet, or just be able to read a book at night. And
And that's the only way to read a book at night. Computer. Nobody ever did that before.
I remember there was one scene where for some reason it's either Bill Gates or Warren Buffett is like on a webcam chat with a village elder, and the village elder offers him like a little owl token, and he says, "This owl is just like you. You're very wise."
This feels so fake.
It's so real. I thought I was like hallucinating.
This is what I would invent.
Yeah.
This is what I would like write as a shit post.
Yes. I was just like cleaning in my house, and all of a sudden I started like seeing this. I was like, "Am I hallucinating?" But yeah,
it feels like a Wonder Shows in bit.
Yes.
You know, like
just Bill Gates coming into an African village, just no power, no electricity, and he's like, "How can I help you, kids?" Like that is a Wonder Shows.
Yeah. And like they build like an electrical grid and then give them computers, but nothing else.
Yes.
Right.
No plumbing,
nothing.
no running water. Like.
Anyway, check it out on Cheddar TV, The Secret Millionaires Club. I think there's like 24 episodes.
When was this a thing? When was this a show?
I know that it got put on Cheddar TV in like 2018. I think I saw it.
That's not a real channel.
It is weird, dude. Yeah. No, it's a pretty recent show. I think the show was produced. Let me look it up to be sure.
Oh my god, the animation style is horrible.
It aired.
It
aired on the Hub Network from 2011 to 2017.
It's called The Secret Millionaires Club.
There were 6 seasons.
I don't think that. No, it was only one season. I guess they aired the episodes sporadically. But it is 26 episodes. So
that's a lot.
I'll be damned.
Oh, here we go. Here's Bill Gates in the village.
Yeah, you see that?
Here, I'll send this to the little DM here.
It looks like the graphics that they use in like those corporate instructional videos.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, like when Amazon has its union busting video.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what it looks like. It's the same people making this.
You have to kill the union in your mind. You have to.
Oh, here's another episode that I'm just like looking at the images now. This one's called A Midwestern Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and there's like a dragon.
That's great.
In the background. So I guess Warren Buffett provides tips and secrets of business.
That's so great.
Find
this is
Excalibur.
Unbelievable. I'm looking at the pictures. I cannot believe this is real. This first picture, the Secret Millionaires Club, looks like a kid apprentice show. You know?
Yes, yeah.
Here's a good episode description here. This is an episode called "The Cost of Giving."
Oh boy!
The Secret Millionaires Club come to the aid of Enzo, the owner of the restaurant Pastopolis, to help increase customer awareness of his business. Is there like do we have like a Secret Millionaire Club meets the Harlem Globetrotters or something like that?
Oh my god.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Almost. We actually do. Here's one. Warren Buffett invites Shaquille O'Neal to help Elena make the right decision of going to an elite sports camp or jeopardizing her education.
How does she jeopardize her education? By smoking weed.
That's right.
I have to get drunk.
There's also
I can't take that.
There's also an anti-piracy episode featuring Nick Cannon.
Oh my god. What?
It's so good. It's awful.
You wouldn't download a car, would you? No, Nick Cannon, I would never do that.
Not if you tell me not to.
Alright, so then download my album. It comes out May 15th.
Oh man. Chris, this is a great segue about children's outreach for you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. So,
oh my god.
Yeah.
We can wait for Shane to come back.
Of course, yeah.
That is horrible.
It is.
I'm definitely gonna watch all of it. But
Me too, honestly. I'm gonna watch all of it, get a little drunk, tweet through it. It'll be fun.
So, Chris, I believe there was another Secret Millionaires Club.
Yeah,
you wanted to talk about.
As much as everything so far has been sort of a glowing, review of Bill Gates' life and times, there is trouble. There is trouble in paradise, and that is that in May of this year, Melinda Gates filed for divorce after 27 years of marriage, and there's
Womp womp.
I know there's lots of can we get the womp womp kind of music there? So, I mean,
a sad slide
exactly,
whistle.
Yeah. And there's, lots of rumors about affairs and attempted affairs and like descriptions of Bill Gates as like some sort of like running around the office like a weird, creepy nerd, like emailing women and like coming up to them in like this weird, unsolicited way and asking them out and stuff. And it's even been implied that it was his behavior with female employees that led to him resigning from the board of Microsoft in 2020.
Oh.
And
his wife was his employee too, right?
She was, yeah. That is how they met, as a matter of fact, yeah. And to read a little bit from this New York Times article that came out last month it's called "Long Before Divorce, Bill Gates Had Reputation for Questionable Behavior." And just reading a little bit from that here, it says, on at least a few occasions, Mr. Gates pursued women who worked for him at Microsoft and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, according to people with direct knowledge of his overtures. In 2019, Microsoft's board of directors, on which Mr. Gates sat, opened an investigation into one of those cases after being notified that he had, quote, sought to initiate an intimate relationship with a company employee in the year 2000. Frank X. Shaw, a Microsoft spokesman, said on Sunday, the board hired a law firm to investigate. The following year, Mr. Gates stepped down from Microsoft's board. The Wall Street Journal reported the 2000 incident and the board's investigation. Quote, there was an affair almost 20 years ago which ended amicably, said Bridget Arnold, a spokeswoman for Mr. Gates. Gates' decision to transition off the board was in no way related to this matter.
Oh, sure.
Right, exactly. And then the article goes on a little bit to talk about, like you were saying, how how Bill and Melinda met. She had joined Microsoft in 1987 as an employee, as a product manager, before they ended up, getting together and getting married in 1994. And then going on to read a little bit more from the same article, it says, long after they married in 1994, Mr. Gates would, on occasion, pursue women in the office. In 2006, for example, he attended a presentation by a female Microsoft employee. Mr. Gates, who at the time was the company's chairman, left the meeting and immediately emailed the woman to ask her out to dinner, according to two people familiar with the exchange. Quote, if this makes you uncomfortable, pretend it never happened, Mr. Gates wrote in an email.
Classic.
According to a person who read it to the New York Times. The woman was indeed uncomfortable, the two people said. She decided to pretend it had never happened. A year or two later, Mr. Gates was on a trip to New York on behalf of the Gates Foundation. He was traveling with a woman who worked for the foundation. Standing with her at a cocktail party, Mr. Gates lowered his voice and said, I want to see you. Will you have dinner with me? According to the woman. The woman, who spoke on the condition of anonymity because she did not want the public attention associated with describing an unwanted advance, said she felt uncomfortable but laughed to avoid responding. 6 current and former employees of Microsoft, the foundation, and the firm that manages the Gates fortune said those incidents and others more recently at times created an uncomfortable workplace environment. Mr. Gates was known for making clumsy approaches to women in and out of the office. His behavior fueled widespread chatter among employees about his personal life. And yeah, I mean, like Vanity Fair actually there's a whole, this is like a developing story. There's like a lot of stuff, obviously coming out every day about their divorce and about some of the more unsavory associations that Bill Gates had. But Vanity Fair just published an article last week, further alleging that like Bill's affairs were like this sort of open secret around Microsoft and around the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And he had like this sort of system for covering his tracks where like he would arrive for work like in his Mercedes, and then like an hour later, one of his security personnel would show up with his Porsche, and then he would like, leave the office in that car. And like they would assume that he was like with women. That's what, one of the employees that they were interviewed about this said. It says, quote, I knew there were many off-site meetings that were not on his calendar. And so then there's also the story of this guy named Michael Larson, who was, he was Bill Gates' money manager for like over 30 years through his firm called Cascade Investment. He oversaw the personal wealth of Bill and Melinda Gates, but also like the endowment of the Gates Foundation and everything like that. The personal wealth, by the way, of Bill and Melinda Gates is estimated to be about $124 billion or more. Now, back in 2017, there were sexual harassment allegations against this guy, Michael Larson, and like the way that was handled has kind of been one of the other things that's stuck out as a sore point in the divorce. And reading back to this article here, it says for nearly 30 years, Mr. Larson had served as Mr. Gates' money manager, earning solid returns on the Gateses and the foundation's combined $174 billion investment portfolio through a secretive operation called Cascade Investment. By the way, everything I saw that mentioned this firm, Cascade Investment, called it secretive or like referred to it as secretive. So
Always a good sign.
Yeah.
always a good sign that everything's on the up and up. It says Cascade owned assets like stocks, bonds, hotels, and vast tracts of farmland, and it also put the Gates' money in other investment vehicles. One was a venture capital firm called Raleigh Capital, which is in the same building that Cascade occupies in Kirkland, Washington. Raleigh Capital had an ownership stake in a nearby bicycle shop. In 2017, the woman who managed the bike shop hired a lawyer who wrote a letter to Mr. Gates and Ms. French Gates, as Melinda now likes to be referred to, as the letter said that Mr. Larson had been sexually harassing the manager of the bike shop, according to 3 people familiar with the claim. The letter said that the woman had tried to handle the situation on her own without success, and she asked the Gateses for help. If they didn't resolve the situation, the letter said, she might pursue legal action. The woman reached a settlement in 2018 in which she signed a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a payment, the 3 people said. While Mr. Gates thought that brought the matter to an end, Ms. French Gates was not satisfied with the outcome, 2 of the people said. She called for a law firm to conduct an independent review of the woman's allegations and of Cascade's culture. Mr. Larson was put on leave while the investigation was underway, but he was eventually reinstated. He remains in charge of Cascade. So, yeah, I mean, in other words, there was this fucking one of Bill Gates' close associates, his money manager for over 3 decades, is caught in this weird, like, sexual harassment allegation thing. And, Bill Gates tried to sweep it under the rug and tried to kind of say, okay, everything's all good, everything's all taken care of. But his wife consulted a law firm and, began in like an independent review, like an outside review of the or investigation of the allegations there. But, speaking of like money and the assets and the divorce and everything, I got kind of a list here. Here's some of the Gates' assets that are like on the table and like being split up as part of the divorce. Because this is probably going to be like the, probably not the largest, but the second largest divorce settlement in U.S. history, probably right after Jeff and Mackenzie Bezos.
Right.
But like, as the assets that are on the table, we got a major stake in the Four Seasons, like other than the Microsoft stuff and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation stuff, obviously. They have a major stake in the Four Seasons Hotel and like other luxury hotel chains. They have hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland. Bill Gates is actually the largest private owner of farmland in the country. He has $500 million worth of property.
Jesus Christ.
Personal real estate valued at $350 million, including their main house in Medina, Washington, which, this is great, Gates calls Xanadu 2.0.
What a fucking nerd.
I hate him.
Xanadu being the name of the fictional estate of Charles Foster Kane in the movie Citizen Kane. Gates bought the property that it sits on for $2 million in 1988 and then spent $63 million over the next 7 years building the home. Xanadu 2.0 has a 60-foot swimming pool with an underwater music system, a 2,500 square foot gym, a 1,000 square foot dining room, 6 kitchens, a dining hall that can seat 200 people. For larger gatherings, they have a 2,300 square foot reception hall that can seat 150 people for dinner or 200 for a cocktail party. The ceiling of the 2,100 square foot home library is engraved with a quotation from The Great Gatsby that says, quote, "He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it." Other assets that Bill and Melinda Gates have to split up between the 2 of them is billions of dollars worth of shares in other companies. AutoNation and Waste Management were 2 of the big ones that were listed there. A fleet of cars and private jets, including 2 $65 million Gulfstream jets, 2 Bombardier Challenger 350s, a Cessna seaplane, and several helicopters.
What could you need that many like flying vehicles for?
You got to get to all the various pervert islands.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. An extensive art collection featuring one of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks.
Fuck off,
Death
dude.
penalty.
Yeah. So, Melinda Gates.
This belongs in a museum.
So Melinda French Gates, as she now prefers to be known, only just filed for divorce last month, but initially began speaking to lawyers about it in the fall of 2019, which is interesting timing because that is around the time that several articles were published, first characterizing the full extent of Bill Gates' relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, who, as we all know, had just been killed in prison by the Clinton crime family just and now this is one of the, like one of the things about Epstein is that he liked to be surrounded by like tech people and like scientists and stuff.
Right.
Like this is one of his kind of main things. He had some very strange like transhumanist ideas like about genetic engineering and artificial intelligence and stuff like that. I mean, eugenics really is the kind of stuff that he was into, as so many of these fucking rich freaks are into. Like remember the thing how he wanted to like seed the human race with his DNA.
Yes.
To like improve the human race. Like he wanted to like impregnate like up to 20 women at a time at his ranch in New Mexico.
What a
like,
sicko, dude.
He wanted to like cryogenically freeze his head and his penis and stuff. But this is like he would hang out with like Steven Pinker and like Stephen Hawking and like scientists and like tell them all this stuff about like how he wants to freeze his penis or whatever. And then they'd be like, oh, that's cool, great, you know. And then he'd give them like a bunch of money for research. He would donate exorbitant amounts of money to specifically Harvard and MIT. But Epstein's donations to the MIT Media Lab were like a really big scandal when that all came out at the end of 2019. Joy Ito is the former director of the MIT Media Lab, and he resigned his position after Ronan Farrow published that article in the New Yorker about all of this at the end of 2019. And sort of at the heart of that scandal was the links that Joy Ito and MIT went to cover up their association with Epstein and the donations that they were receiving from him. Because for years, Epstein acted as sort of like an intermediary between the lab and other wealthy donors, like soliciting millions of dollars in donations from them. And Epstein's donations and his contact with the lab and like even his visits to the lab, like they were all kept secret. And like when he would visit, like he would visit MIT and they would log him just by his initials as JE. This is in like 2013, 2014. Like they're well aware, like they know Jeffrey Epstein's deal. Like this is, they're well aware of his 2008 conviction, but they're continuing to take money from him that is laundered through other donors. And one of those donors was Bill Gates. So reading a little bit from the Ronan Farrow article now, in September 2014, Ito wrote to Epstein soliciting a cash infusion to fund a certain researcher, asking, quote, could you re-up, top off with another $100,000 so we can extend his contract another year? Epstein replied, yes. Forwarding the response to a member of his staff, Ito wrote, quote, make sure this gets accounted for as anonymous. Peter Cohen, the MIT Media Lab's director of development and strategy at the time, reiterated, Jeffrey money needs to be anonymous. Thanks. Epstein's apparent role in directing outside contributions was also elided. In October 2014, the Media Lab received a $2 million donation from Bill Gates. Ito wrote in an internal email, this is a $2 million gift from Bill Gates directed by Jeffrey Epstein. Cohen replied, for gift recording purposes, we will not be mentioning Jeffrey's name as the impetus for this gift. A mandatory record of the gift filed within the university stated only that, quote, Gates is making this gift at the recommendation of a friend of his who wishes to remain anonymous. Knowledge of Epstein's alleged role was usually kept within a tight circle. In response to the university filing, Cohen wrote to colleagues, I did not realize that this would be sent to dozens of people, adding that Epstein is, quote, is not named but questions could be asked, and that I, quote, felt uncomfortable that this was distributed so widely. He wrote that further filings related to Epstein should be submitted only, quote, if there is a way to do it quietly. An agent for Gates wrote to the leadership of the Media Lab stating that Gates also wished to keep his name out of any public discussion of the donation. Around the end of 2014 is supposedly like that's when Gates and Epstein supposedly broke off all communication. Like they met with each other like dozens of times from starting in 2011, I believe January 2011, all the way through the end of 2014. They used to say 3 times. Like the original reporting that came out at the end of 2019 said 3 times. Bill Gates met Epstein at his townhouse in Manhattan 3 times. That's been amended to now say dozens.
Dozens?
They met dozens of times. I don't have any, more specific number than that, including many times at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. Employees, not just Gates himself, but like other than Gates, on other occasions, employees of the Gates Foundation also visited Epstein's mansion, acting as intermediaries between the two men. And again, this is 2011. Everybody knows Epstein's deal. There's a reason MIT is trying to keep this shit secretive, right? Everybody knows Epstein's deal. Everybody knows his his 2008 conviction. And these early talks, like the first meeting between Epstein and Gates was the end of January 2011. And it was between Epstein, Gates, this guy named James Staley, who is a senior JP Morgan executive, and Larry Summers, who had just ended his term as Obama's director of the National Economic Council like a week and a half earlier, and who had also been, the Secretary of the Treasury under Bill Clinton. So they're all meeting, and like supposedly the nature of what they're meeting about is discussing this plan for the Gates Foundation and JP Morgan to team up and create a charitable fund called the Global Health Investment Fund, with Epstein in place as a go-between between the organization and like other wealthy donors. With Epstein, like the plan being that Epstein would be paid a 0.3% of whatever money he raised. So like if Epstein raised $10 billion, he would have been paid $30 million in fees. And supposedly this didn't come to fruition. The charitable organization, the Global Health Investment Fund, does exist and does still exist. But supposedly the discussed idea of having Epstein as an intermediary supposedly never came to fruition. But it's like the question has to be asked, like, why do these other powerful men like Bill Gates and like Larry Summers and the JP Morgan guy, like, why did they have to have this famous pedophile to serve as an intermediary between them and other rich donors? Like, they don't know other rich people themselves. Like, they have to have Jeffrey Epstein. Like, they have to invent this like bogus, unnecessary position for Epstein that's going to further enrich him. I'm sure it's nothing. I'm sure it's all fine. But there's a couple more. I got a couple quotes here from some emails that Bill Gates sent to some friends and colleagues after his first meeting with Jeffrey Epstein in 2011. He said, quote, "His lifestyle is very different and kind of intriguing, although it would not work for me." And here's another one here, just discussing one of Bill Gates' visit to Epstein's townhouse in Manhattan. Quote, "A very attractive Swedish woman and her daughter dropped by, and I ended up staying there quite late."
Oh, I really hate that one.
Sure, it's nothing. I'm sure it's nothing. But like I said, this is a developing story. There's still a lot of stuff coming out. There's a couple Daily Beast articles that just came out recently, like claiming like a bunch of other stuff about like the details of the meetings between Epstein and Gates, that like Bill Gates saw like his meetings with Epstein, or like getting to go hang out with Epstein is like a boys club type thing, and he would like it was like an escape from his marriage to Melinda, and he would go and he would seek supposedly marital advice from Epstein, who
God
is not married.
Marital advice. Okay,
right, and who also like not only is not married, but is not particularly interested in adult women in the first place. And so they would say that Bill Gates would go and try to seek marital advice from Epstein about how to end his toxic marriage. And then the other thing,
please,
the other thing was that supposedly this is what one of the other Daily Beast articles that they recently published was saying that Epstein hoped that his work with the Gates Foundation would help rehabilitate his image after his 2008 conviction. So, like, again, it can't be denied that Bill Gates, knew about the 2011 conviction. That's why all this kind of stuff was kept hush-hush. That's why he helped him, send those donations anonymously to MIT. They all knew what Epstein's deal was. And, even...
Bill, you help me rehab my image, and I'll... And then
fill
the rest
in the blank.
is just blacked out.
Yeah, right. Right. So, it's very obvious, like, kind of any one of these interactions that Epstein has with any of these other rich sickos is obviously very transactional.
Those emails that you read, did those just come out, like, recently? Like, the thing about the Swedish woman and her daughter? Or was that, like, from before?
Yeah, I believe they did. I believe they were from this article that just came out in the New York Times, May 16th.
Just the media blitz that Melinda Gates is doing to ruin this man is amazing.
Scorched her.
Yeah.
Go off,
Yeah, no, it's good. That's why, that's why, like, by the time this comes out, there might be so much more weird little fucking sick details that have come out about this. Because, of course, she's, her PR team is working overdrive to make sure she gets the most out of the divorce, and go off, queen. But the other funny thing here that was mentioned in the Daily Beast article was that, like, not only did Epstein hope that Gates might rehabilitate rehabilitate his image like after his conviction. But like supposedly Bill Gates was hoping that Epstein might be able to like use his connections. And I don't understand. This is baffling to me. But supposedly Bill Gates thought that Epstein might be able to use his connections to help get his foot in the door for receiving a Nobel Prize. That's one of the things that's come out recently.
Me, the richest man, I can't do it.
Yeah.
Again, like that's
the king of pedophiles.
Yeah, that's what's so. Yeah, it's like all these bogus ways to insert this guy who's literally nothing but like just a famous pedophile into these other weird like quid pro quo transactional type things. But here's a quote from what a representative for Bill Gates told the Daily Beast. Quote, "Your characterization of his meetings with Epstein and others about philanthropy is inaccurate, including who participated. Similarly, any claim that Gates spoke of his marriage or Melinda in a disparaging manner is false." Now, I mean, even setting aside that it's Epstein or anything like that, it's a single guy talking with a married guy whose marriage is on the rocks. We're not supposed to believe that the marriage never came up, that he never like complained about Melinda or anything like that. Like that's not believable. It goes on here to say Bill never received or solicited personal advice of any kind from Epstein on marriage or anything else. Bill never complained about Melinda or his marriage to Epstein. And then what did I say here about the? Here's the.
You said they saw each other dozens of times.
Dozens of times.
That's like more times than we've seen each other, and we're like best friends.
Exactly.
I love when that happens. I love when it's like I used the plane 37 times. It's like
a normal amount.
What it reminded me of is like one of those. It's like one of those like when you're taking like a one of those like Likert scale tests or whatever for like an employment application, and they ask you like this. They have like test questions to see if you'll lie about them. Like, have you ever lied to your boss, or have you ever lied to a prior boss, or have you ever lied to anybody? Like they'll present this question that like with the idea being that if you say no to this, you will be lying, right? Like that's kind of the psychological, I guess, idea behind the question. That's what this sort of reminded me of. It's like even like set aside who it is, that it's Epstein and fucking Bill Gates. Like we're supposed to believe that this guy whose marriage is coming to an end, like hung out with his single friend and didn't complain about his wife or something like that. Like that's like totally. Like,
what a weird thing to even try to deny.
It's like
totally
abject denialism.
But two other things I wanted to mention here that are very interesting is the two people who were the people who introduced Epstein and Gates and who served as intermediaries between them, and then finally ultimately introduced them. One of them is a woman named Melanie Walker, who had been an associate of Epstein since 1992 and served as his science advisor. Apparently Epstein had a science advisor that she started that position in 1998 before moving to Seattle and joining the Gates Foundation in 2006. So she went.
Coincidence.
So she went directly from Epstein to on the board of the Gates Foundation. And the second one here is even wilder. This guy named Boris Nikolic, who is a biotech venture capitalist who longtime associate of Gates and the Gates Foundation. He's an advisor to Bill Gates, and he's also a friend of this woman Melanie Walker, who is the one who introduced him to Epstein many years ago, and they became close friends. Now, this guy Boris Nikolic, who is the one who introduced Epstein and Bill Gates, 2 days before Epstein died, murdered or whatever, 2 days before he died, he amended his will, and one of the things he did was add this guy Boris Nikolic as an executor of his will. It was one of his last acts before he died. So I don't know. I'm sure it's nothing.
I don't know. To me, Nico Bellic sounds trustworthy.
It's like Nico Belichick in the Grand Theft Auto.
Yes.
It's a nice little guy.
Cousin, we go flying, yes?
Every single detail I ever learned about someone and their connection to Epstein smells like a fucking turd. Every single time. There's never been anything that's just coincidence or like innocent. It's always like, oh yeah, he's on my board, or like we were best friends, or we met 35 times, or he used my plane like for 20 years. I knew when that, or Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, yeah, I believe Bill Gates. I believe it is confirmed that he flew on Epstein's plane at least once from New York to Palm Beach, and
At least once.
Yeah.
I believe Ghislaine was on there, and I believe, I may be mistaken, but I believe Alan Dershowitz was on that trip as well. I may be wrong about that, but Bill Gates.
They were just talking about the
Death
wall,
penalty.
you know?
At least one confirmed trip on the
League of
Lolita
Extraordinary
Express.
Gentlemen.
The secret
It's like
Millionaires
the
Club.
That's the real secret. Millionaires Club.
I remember the Clinton Global Initiative had Bill Clinton and trotted him out to be like, look, Epstein used our plane dozens of times for trips to Africa or Asia or the United States, but this is normal.
Yeah.
You know, this is what people with planes do. You know, you let your friends use your car without your knowledge or any sort of input from you regularly, right? We let them use our planes.
What's the big deal?
It's only $400 million, you know?
That reminds me, in one of the docs towards the end of the documentary, right? And it was probably produced in like the late 90s or something. And again, it's very glowing of Bill Gates. Towards the end, it's like
At the age of 42, Bill Gates was an icon of the American establishment. The richest man in the world with a personal net worth of more than $50 billion and a member of a power elite, which included President Bill Clinton, who shared his newfound enthusiasm for golf.
and there's like a picture of the two of them looking at each other like, it's like, all right. Well, you know, in retrospect, you might want to, you missed scrubbing that one.
Who could have known?
Yeah.
Reminds me of that video that went around a few months ago where MTV was describing Epstein's crib and his wealth. Have you not seen
No.
this video? Oh my god, it feels.
Was it like MTV
like
Cribs?
Something. It was like literally. I think they were like, this Playboy billionaire is very exclusive or secluded
That's
from,
really
but
sick.
he has the largest residence in Manhattan. It's like a very like one of their segments.
Financier Jeffrey Epstein. Jeff was a high school math teacher until he traded his blackboard for the big board in 1976, eventually launching his own exclusive finance firm for billionaire clients. But he just couldn't keep out of the classroom. So when he was shopping for a new house, he bought himself an entire schoolhouse and transformed it into the largest single residence in all of Manhattan at a whopping 51,000 square feet.
The school cost about $20 million, and he's dropped $10 million just renovating it.
It has incredible bells and whistles, closed-circuit televisions, a heated sidewalk out front, so the snow melts.
But only one man truly rules the Wall Street skies. Because for former schoolteacher turned billionaire Jeffrey Epstein, one private plane won't do. He's got a small fleet. A Gulfstream 4, a Cessna, and a Boeing 727 with, of course, an in-flight trading room.
He has a Boeing 727. I'm just wondering now, what do you need a commercial-size airliner for?
Believe us, it comes in handy when you've got powerful friends to fly around. When Bill Clinton organized a week-long tour of Africa in 2002, Jeff gave him a ride in his personal 727 and took actors Kevin Spacey and Chris Tucker along for the trip.
Now, for former President Clinton, it was a chance to investigate the problems of AIDS in Africa, and for Epstein, it was a chance to hang out with some of his big-shot friends.
Jet setting with Bill, all in a day's work for Wall Street mogul.
It feels like something someone would do as a bit for an a cold
Right.
open.
I know exactly the video you're talking about, and I did not want to believe it was real until I Googled it and independently corroborated that
That's surreal.
It seemed so fake. Yeah.
No, because I trusted the person who tweeted it, and I was still like, "This is you got duped." You know? As is the case with this stuff, because it's just so surreal how so many people in that orbit seem to fall into it so completely, but then everyone, I guess, in the reporting or in talking about it in general culture, has to be like, no, it was just nothing.
Don't worry about it. It's normal.
Like, yeah, you know. I feel like it's still not, even though we know Bill Gates has these connections, it's still not really like a thought of, I guess, beyond like, or I mean, now maybe with the turning tide against him. But even then, like when the first few links emerged, coverage of it seemed to be like, oh, that's weird, but, falter of judgment, right?
Right. There's never any consequences, really.
Right.
Right. Or just to like give him the benefit of the doubt, which is just, it's not, you can't, it's not possible. It's like we're supposed to believe that, like again, it's 2011 when he met him. Epstein has already been convicted. Right. Yeah. Everybody knows his deal, right?
There's one reason to associate with him.
Yeah, there's exactly. Every one of his acquaintances with other wealthy and powerful men is transactional in some way, and like Bill Gates is not an exception to that.
It'd be wild to it's like insulting also to believe what is told, which is like, yeah, the world's richest man who has his time booked for him like well in advance and is meeting with people constantly, has no idea who this guy is and had no curiosity whatsoever and never happened to learn anything about him over the subsequent dozens of meetings that they had. It was a total surprise, and he just shocked his
He's just a harmless geek. He doesn't know anything.
He's a big fucking nerd, And that's why we love Bill Gates.
How do we sum this up? I mean, to revive a on and off bit, we sometimes do and often forget to do. Like, what would be like the apt punishment for Bill Gates? And the first obvious one is I'll just take all of his money, like all of it, and I don't know, maybe like put him in a room just filled with like those like kind of cross section. You remember those like books we had as a kid, where
the pop-up
it'd be like
books?
A cross section of, not a pop up book, but it would be like of a pirate ship,
or
like a castle.
Sure.
Yeah. Like just put posters of that in like a padded room he can't escape, but of like hospitals and like different medical infrastructure, and just let him boil himself to death in anger staring at it.
Or a live feed of his money being poured into those things.
Perfect.
There you go. That's pretty good.
I would lock him in the Sarah Winchester house that has one toilet.
Oh God! What a weird little freaky scumbag.
Truly a goblin.
Yeah, like a real goblin person. Yeah, like just a horrible, like, and a lineage of just like evil, wicked colonizers and like wealthy bankers. It's just a real bag of shit. I don't know. At least Microsoft and Windows is really good. Everybody loves it. Everybody loves using those products.
And Internet Explorer, Windows Media Player,
Microsoft Edge,
the cream of the crop.
We love it.
Yeah,
we love it.
I'm using it right now.
Yeah,
I actually am.
There's some new fucking update that happened in like the last 2 days or something on my computer, where now there's this thing on my taskbar that has like all the news. I don't want this, and I can't remove it.
Where, like in your web browser, you mean?
No, in the toolbar for the fucking
like in Microsoft Word.
It's like
he downloaded a virus.
Like headlines.
Yeah, you gotta microwave the computer.
I gotta say though, ever since I got the COVID vaccine, I am really loving these Microsoft products.
Yeah, sometimes I hear a little beeping sound when I get near my PC, and then I blank out for a few seconds. I don't know what's up with that.
Well, Ed, thank you so much for joining us on this quite long and big boy episode on this son of a bitch. Where can people find your stuff?
You can find me on Twitter at Big Black Jacobin, and the podcast at Machine Kills Pod, where we talk about more tech overlords and how horrible capitalism and technology are together.
Well, thanks again for coming on and spending several hours of your useful time on a weekend where you could have otherwise been relaxing or doing your own work to talk about this horrible man goblin.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I had a great time talking about the God Emperor of Nerds. Really great.
It's like the end of 1984. Like, they loved Bill Gates.
Yeah, actually, what will happen is before this episode is produced, they'll like take each of us into a room and put a rat. Censor out the part about Epstein. Censor out the part about Epstein.
And I'd also like just to end here by saying, Melinda, come on the show.
Please.
Yeah, let it all let it all out. Let it all out.
Come on.
And give us your money, too.
Yeah, that too.
All right, folks, that's it. I never know how
Yeah,
to
me
end
neither.
this.
All right.
everybody.
Love you. Bye.
Get out of here.
Bye-bye.
Go away now.
You wouldn't take your broken leg to a mechanic. You wouldn't call an engineer when your heart aches. You wouldn't trust the man who fucked up the Titanic. So why the hell are we still listening to Bill Gates with his stupid sweaters and his creepy smile? He's not a doctor and I'm really wondering why. He's on TV telling me what I can or cannot do. I've had enough of his bluff. I just wanna know the truth. No, there will never be a better time to wake up and do the opposite of what he advocates. It wouldn't shock me